All right, what we're going to take a look at here to get started in the process of dovetailing the drawers, we're going to look at some sawing exercises. It's a good idea to do these somewhat before you get going with the dovetails. Dovetailing is actually fairly straightforward, easy, if you can use a saw. Therefore, it's better to practice, become proficient with the saw before you dive into the dovetailing. So I'll show you a few things to maybe help out with the sawing technique. I've got a scrap piece of wood here, set my marking gauge to the thickness of the stock, and I'm just going to scribe a baseline on each side. Don't worry about anything related to dovetailing. You know, it's completely different in a sense, although you would set this up similar. We're just sawing lines here, but when you do saw in dovetailing, you have to end at the baseline. So having that target to work towards, not to go beyond, not to come up short is worth doing as your practice. All right, so I'll put that in the vise. I've got my dovetail template here. This one happens to be a 1:6. It's a ratio. It means for every 1 inch of run, you have 6 inches of rise, and you would set the bevel at that 1:6. It's about 10 degrees. You can get them in 1:8, which is actually a little bit less splay. I prefer this. They also do it in a 14 degree, which has more splay, but again, I kind of stick with just the 1:6 for all my dovetailing. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice two different cuts. First, we're going to do the tail cuts. After we do show you that, we'll show you how to do the second half of the dovetail, which is the pins. So I'm just going to draw a series of lines here. I'm using a pen, so hopefully it shows up a little bit better on the video. Wouldn't need to use a knife at all here. Pencil would be just fine. And just move your template about 1/4 of an inch. They're perpendicular on the end of the board. They're sloping down the face, and they should slope inward from the edge. I'm going to go halfway across from the right side to the middle, and then I'm going to do the opposite to this, coming in from the left side. Because we've got 2 halves of the tail that we need to cut, so we'll practice both left and right cuts. So now we'll come over to this side and just do the same thing, moving in. I'll make mention here that as you do the cutting, when you're sawing the marks on the right, your saw should be to the right of the mark. If that were a dovetail, that's where you would be sawing. To the waist side of this tail would be to the right. Here on the left side, the waist is on the left, so when I make these cuts, the saw is going to be to the left. All right, so with those laid out, I'm just going to make these cuts. Now, I want to stress something. The most critical cut here is the one on the end of the board, that you follow this perpendicular cut accurately. If you don't follow the slope perfectly, it's fine, because whatever we do down the face here gets transferred to the other half of the joint. But if we don't get these things accurate, we're challenged throughout the process. So focus on being accurate on the end cuts. I'm going to start on this side. Due to the perspective of the camera, you'll be able to see a little bit better what's going on. So when I saw, I actually start at the back of the board rather than at the front. I also notice I'm to the waist side, to the left here on the left half, just right up to the line, but I'm not taking it. Something I should also mention with a saw, a challenge that a lot of people have is that they're very grabby when you start. The key is to actually take weight off the saw Oftentimes people just really want to bear down and it digs in and it grabs and it's very difficult to get it to go. The whole secret in starting a saw is really to take the weight off it. Very light touch as you start. So we start at the back, and then we can lower our hand down and we can just follow that line from the back to the front. Okay, so we did well paralleling that line. Now we just need to focus and bring it down the face. As I mentioned, this cut's not that critical. If we follow the line precisely, that's good, but it's not essential. I could come a little bit straighter down. I could go over the line a little bit. It's all going to work. So let's do this one again. Just repeat that. Start at the back with a real light touch. Lower it down. Bring it to the front. Now saw down and stop at your baseline. I should make mention of cuts on the left versus the right. I'm right-handed, and so doing these cuts on the left are a little bit tricky for me because my body position is actually, my side is obscured by the saw. So I have to poke my head over to get this started because I do have to see the lines. But once I get to this point, I actually get my body in a completely different position, and I'm actually looking below the saw because I can't poke my head over here or I'm out of position, and it really wants to bind. The thing you need to work on is finding this body position where your elbow, your forearm, your wrist, the saw are all in alignment. If I'm back here, timber. If I'm back here, the saw is going to bind because my arm is coming on an angle like this. If I'm crowding the saw, I'm going to have trouble too because now my arm's coming in this way. What you need to do is find that position where that arm is coming straight through the cut. And that's why I can't really poke my head over here because when I do that, it gets me out of alignment. So find that nice body position. I'm looking below the saw as I make these cuts. Here I've got my head poked over so that I can start it. Lower it down, get your body in position, and stop at the baseline. Just also try to use the bulk of your saw when you cut. A lot of people just make these short little strokes like this. Use the whole of the saw. Long, steady strokes are very efficient. Now I'm going to make some on the other side, on the right hand cuts. Exactly the same thing, but my saw is now to the right side of the line. Light touch. Now I can see everything clearly because my sight is right down into there. Nothing obscures it. Real light touch to start at the back, lower it down. Okay. Those are the tail cuts. One thing I should also show or talk about is if you make a good cut, so you follow your line nicely, you bring it down here. It's not a bad idea as you're getting started with this. Just sit here and go back and forth. Don't even try to cut. Just go back and forth and find that body position where that saw goes straight through without any binding. And this is the position you've just has to become second nature as you work. Okay, so there's tail cuts. Let's show you the second half of the dovetail joint, and that's the pin. We're going to do the same thing here. We'll scribe a couple baselines. Now, the layout on this is actually a bit different. we're going to start in the middle as opposed to starting on the edges and working towards the center. So let me, okay. And what we have to do is we're going to draw one pin in the middle. Now, when we look at a pin, I don't actually have a joint here to demonstrate this, but I'll draw one. The narrow part of the pin is always towards you or towards the outside. It faces you. So I'm going to draw one pin here. So bring it across the end. This is different than the tail, which was perpendicular on the end and sloping down the face. The pin is sloping on the end and plumb down the face. So now I'm going to come over here and do this side. Okay, we're just one pin right there. In dovetailing, this is what it would look like. The narrow part here will be facing you. That's the outside of the board. Where it splays back is the inside. And we will cut to this side of the line. To the right side, this is going to be the waist, and to the left on that pin. Now we're going to draw a series of lines, and the reason I start in the middle is so that as we work out, we can kind of see the spacing that we need. So just the same thing, but this one we draw one pin and work to either side, to the left and to the right. Same thing applies that did before, is when you go to make the cuts, if they're left of center, the waist is on the left, right of center is to the right. So we'll do that, and now we'll go this way. Same things apply as before. You want to get your body in position. One thing I did fail to mention on the tail cuts is you do start with your saw on a bit of an angle, because the cut you're making is on an angle. If you try to start it like this and then tip it, it's not as good. Now on the pin cuts, the saw is always just held upright or plumb. Let's do the left ones here again, and I have the same challenge that the saw is kind of in the way of my sight. Nonetheless, you do have to just do that. Poke my head over so that I can see what I'm doing. Light touch at the back, follow to the front, and straight down. Come up right close to the pencil or knife mark. Bring it straight down to the baseline. I get my body in position here as I make the cut downward. I'm out of position here because I need to poke my head over so I can see what I need to see to get things started. Don't grip the saw real firmly, just a nice light touch. Notice too, your thumb is positioning the saw, moving it right up to the spot. Then it stays there as you get the cut started. Once you've established the cut, you can move it. Okay. Now we'll do the right cuts, and we'll be sawing on the right side of the line here, just the same. These are a bit easier because I can see everything completely, start to finish. Do one more. Okay. Now we're going to give you one more bit of information, but if you spent some time just making these cuts, the tail cuts, sloping inward from the end, the pin cuts, sloping outward on the end there, starting in the middle with one pin and then progressing outward. There's one other saw cut that we actually have to become somewhat proficient at in dovetailing, and that is using the coping saw. That's what we use to get rid of the waste between the pins and tails. Again, don't worry about this. It really doesn't have anything to do with the dovetailing process. It's basically just a sawing exercise. So I'm going to draw a line below my baseline here, and then I'm going to cut this off with the coping saw. Now, I'm actually going to make a few lines here so that I get a bit of practice. I don't need a line over here because I'm going to start on this side and go to the left. So I'll bring this across here, and then I do want a line here to help me get my saw started. I'm going to do one more, just spaced a little bit. Okay, so now we'll put it back in the vise, and I'm just going to use the coping saw to make those 3 cuts. Those represent the baseline of the joint, and of course you always want to be above the baseline. It is the ultimate line at which you pair or cut to. So when we remove the bulk of the waste with a coping saw, we want to be just above that line. So I'll get it started on the side here. Now notice one thing here with a coping saw. I have it such that when the blade is level, the back is up here. If that's not the case, if you've got it in alignment and you're trying to do a wider board, sometimes you end up hooking this and not able to complete the cut. So generally with a coping saw, you have the back up out of the way. I'll get it started here, and again, right here, we're just trying to be close. We're not trying to cut exactly to the line. In fact, we want to be at about a 32nd of an inch away from the line. That way our chisel can go in and find its little slot and make the cut. So we don't want to be too close. At the same time, we don't want to be too far away. Okay, I've got it started there. I like to have my left hand pardon the noise. I like my left hand on the back side of the saw because I'm able to get a sense for what level is all about. There are a couple ways you can do this. Some people just go one-handed. Others actually use 2 hands right here. And the other method, which I typically use, is one on each end of the saw. In terms of the blade, I have the teeth pointing forward, so I'm actually cutting on the push. If you're more comfortable, turn it around and cut on the pull, kind of like the Japanese do. I should also mention, use a very narrow blade. For this here, doesn't matter. Any blade will do. But once we get into the dovetailing, you need a very slender blade so that it's easy to turn and make the cut. We'll show you that when we show you the dovetailing process. So now I'm just going to focus on coming across and steering the saw. You know, if I'm getting too close to the line, I let the back drop and the blade comes up. If I'm getting away from the line, I lift the back up and it steers the teeth back down. Long strokes again, hold the saw level. Just above the line. Okay, I'm going to just do one more here. So same thing, we'll start just above the line here on the edge. And then come across nice and steady. Let the blade come straight through. I see people push down, you know, like this, and that blade is just having to work its way through. Just find that sweet spot where it can come through effortlessly. Steer it, moving the back up and down. Okay. Spend a little bit of time with those 3 different cuts. Your tail cut, your pin cut, and then the coping saw. If you become proficient and comfortable with that, dovetailing is just nothing to it. So take a little bit of time, work through that, and then I'm going to put together a video that shows the whole process of cutting the joinery for our drawers.